to spend time with Prince Philip and experience his wit and charm. The statement said that he knows that that will be missed and expressed his condolences to the Queen and the British people. But we are expecting a statement from the White House. We're not entirely sure when it will come for that.
Lebu, many thanks. Lebu Duseka there in Washington. Let's go now to Rajini Vaidyanathan in Delhi. And Rajini, the Queen, of course, well known for her great dedication to the Commonwealth, but that will have been the case too for the Duke of Edinburgh. Just talk us through his ties to the region.
Well, it's interesting, actually, because even before he married into royalty, Prince Philip had deep connections to South Asia. His uncle was Lord Mountbatten, the first Governor-General of an independent India and the last Viceroy of India. So he already had connections to this country back then. But also, when he was in the Royal Navy, he was stationed during the Second World War in Sri Lanka, known back then as Ceylon. So they were his ties back then. Now, when he married the Queen, he and Her Majesty visited India on a number of occasions. I think we actually have some pictures that we can show you of their royal visit in 1961 when they were guests of India on Republic Day. And during that visit, they visited the Taj Mahal. They travelled to a number of cities, including Jaipur. And actually, Rita, Prince Philip and the Queen have very close links with the royal family in Jaipur. And there's a lovely anecdote that I was reading that members of the royal family in Jaipur would always send a box of Alfonso mangoes to Prince Philip on his birthday because he was so fond of them.
And there are no better mangoes than Alfonso mangoes, as we know. Rajini, how will the Duke of Edinburgh be remembered in India?
Well, I think it's those personal connections that are really what will run deep. The fact that he's visited on a number of occasions. But here's something that struck me as well. Of course, in the UK, as you know, the Duke of Edinburgh scheme is a big thing in schools, but it actually has also been a big thing in schools here in India. So somebody was telling me how they remember when they were at school doing the Duke of Edinburgh here in India, but actually meeting Prince Philip on one of his visits to India, and he personally gave her the award, and she will always remember that as just a wonderful memory of him. And so, you know, I think that is what will strike people, is just, of course, we know the ties, post-colonial and, of course, colonial ties between the two countries, and, you know, the deep impact that the royal family has. And you mentioned Prime Minister Modi's statement there. I mean, he mentioned himself that Prince Philip was at the forefront of many community service initiatives. So I was quite struck at how many people mentioned the Duke of Edinburgh scheme here to me in India as well as one of his lasting legacies.
It's very interesting because a lot of people will know the Duke of Edinburgh without realising that they do, because they took part in that scheme. And in that sense, his influence really has been extremely broad.
Exactly, as you say. It is worth mentioning we've also had a statement from Prime Minister Imran Khan in Pakistan. He said Britain has lost a wise elder who imbued a unique spirit of public service. So once again, the reason I'm mentioning that is that public service is something that really is noted here in the region.
Rajini, many thanks. Our correspondent in Delhi, Rajini Vaidyanathan there. You are watching a BBC News special programme. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, at the age of 99. Prince Philip was by far the longest-serving consort in British history, a role he shaped right from the start. He was 26 when he married the then Princess Elizabeth in 1947. Within 5 years, she would be Queen.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Tributes to the Duke and messages of condolence to the Queen have been sent from leaders around the world, including here in the UK.
We mourn Today, with Her Majesty the Queen, we offer our condolences to her and to all her family. And we give thanks as a nation and a kingdom for the extraordinary life and work of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
In recent years, there had been signs that Prince Philip's health was declining. He'd been admitted to hospital a number of times throughout the last decade. He recently returned home to Windsor on the 16th of March after a month-long hospital stay. His loss will be felt most keenly by the Queen, his family and beyond. People have been laying flowers outside the gates of Windsor Castle, where the Duke passed away peacefully this morning. And the flag is flying at half-mast at Buckingham Palace. Well, if you are just joining us, we are broadcasting a special programme following the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course. The royal family joins with people around the world in mourning his loss." Well, we can speak now to our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell, who's outside Buckingham Palace for us. And Sarah, when we spoke a little earlier, you said that people were coming down to Buckingham Palace to express their sadness and lay flowers.
That's right, Rita. And what's interesting is that there's a real mix of ages when you walk amongst the crowd. So there are some young people. One girl told me she'd come down because her grandma had wrung her in tears when she heard the news, and she wanted her granddaughter to go and lay a tribute or just be here. Other people saying they just wanted to come down to Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace, of course, the London home of the royal family, the building perhaps around the world most associated with Prince Philip and the Queen, so understandable that people would want to come here. There was an announcement posted on the railings of Buckingham Palace, but normally that announcement of the death would have been left up for around 24 hours, but it was taken down within an hour because there is a real concern that while the royal family understand that people will want to mourn and reflect on Prince Philip's life and death, what they don't want to happen is for crowds to gather. So actually at Buckingham Palace there, people are being moved on, so they are laying tributes. They are standing there, but they're not being allowed to stand there for very long. But I guess wanting to come down and remember all the times that they will have seen Prince Philip on the balcony there of Buckingham Palace, thousands of people he would have spoken to in the grounds of Buckingham Palace for one of the garden parties that are held every year, and indeed his very final solo engagement. He did 22,000 solo engagements over a life that was dedicated to service and public duty. That was here in August of 2017. It was a Captain General's parade. He was sort of saying goodbye as Captain General of the Royal Marines. They played for He's a Jolly Good Fellow. He left the forecourt. It was chucking it down with rain, and he had a little sort of tear in the corner of his eye. And it was a real seminal moment, a very moving moment, because it really was the end of a life of public service. And since then, really, we haven't seen much of Prince Philip in public life. He did retire. He said himself he thought he'd done his bit, which can't be any exaggeration. And so he spent much of the last few years on a cottage at Sandringham until, of course, last March with the pandemic, when he relocated to Windsor Castle and spent really the last year almost solely with the Queen at Windsor Castle in their own sort of little bubble. And so perhaps, hopefully today, it's some comfort to the Queen to know that they did spend 12 months together. It would prove to be the final 12 months of Prince Philip's life, and hopefully that's some comfort. And I'm sure they spent many hours talking and reflecting on what an extraordinary life they've both lived.
Yes, indeed. And Sarah, I know that you've spent some time talking to people who have come to lay flowers. What have people been saying to you?
As I say, I mean, there's a sense of sadness. amongst the crowd. Somebody, a young boy, has said that there was a real mix of ages, and it's really interesting. One young lad said it was an end of an era, that Prince Philip represented sort of an end of a generation, which is quite interesting. I asked another 15-year-old what Prince Philip meant to him, and he said, well, he's just really famous. His mum, who was there, said he'll just be really missed. And then grandmother said overwhelmingly that we're just thinking about the Queen and the loss that she has suffered. I mean, remember, they were married for 73 years, longer than most of us have been alive. And so thoughts, I'm sure, will be with her, having lost her partner for life, and somebody who she has talked about as being her strength and her stay, and certainly the one who has been the rock throughout her role as Queen, which, you know, is a unique role, potentially a very lonely role, but was made much less so by the constant presence of her husband, Prince Philip.
Sarah, we should say that viewers were just seeing there the sign, the announcement that was put up on the gates announcing the Duke of Edinburgh's death, but that has now been taken down, I think you mentioned earlier, in order to discourage people from staying and reading and being in crowds.
Absolutely right. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, there are people behind me, some people who, it's the Easter holidays, of course, the schools are off, so people might have been here anyway. But yes, those announcements of any big royal event, important royal national event, will be posted on the railings of Buckingham Palace. And normally it would have stayed there for much longer. But there is a real desire, a real understanding that they don't want to have anything which might attract crowds of people, because it's, you know, it's simply not safe at the moment. And so I think that is going to be a consideration, very much a consideration for the authorities as we go through the next few days, is working out how best such an important life in the history of this country, how Prince Philip's life can be celebrated and mourned, but in a way which, of course, has to respect the restrictions of the pandemic. So, as I say, people are coming today. They were reading the notice, but they were being asked to queue and then to read it and then move on. And now people, when they come and lay flowers, they are being asked to move on.
Sarah, thank you very much. That's our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell, there, live outside Buckingham Palace. We can go to Windsor now and to our correspondent, Helena Wilkinson. And Helena, Sarah there was talking about thoughts turning to how the Duke of Edinburgh's life can be celebrated and how his passing can be mourned. And in the last hour or so, you've had some details about arrangements for his funeral.
Yes, that's right, Rita. So in the last hour, some detail from the College of Arms about the funeral arrangements, as Sarah touched on there. We are still living under COVID restrictions, so that had to be taken into account when arranging the funeral. But the details we've had so far, and I think we will get more details over the next day or so, is that the Duke of Edinburgh's body will lie in rest here at Windsor Castle ahead of the funeral, which will take place at St George's Chapel, which is just behind us in the grounds of Windsor Castle. The statement goes on to say that this is in line with custom and also with His Royal Highness's wishes. There is also a note about the funeral arrangements having been revised, of course, because of the COVID restrictions, and they also say that they regretfully request that members of the public do not attempt to attend or participate in any of the events that make up the funeral. So some details about the funeral. I think we, of course, can expect more to come perhaps in the next hours or days or so. But here at Windsor Castle, the Royal Standard, which is the flag meaning that the Queen is in residence, is flying at full mast here. That is the only flag that will not be lowered on this occasion. But here in Windsor, a town which has seen over the years many royal events, both happy and sad, today it is one of quiet reflection. And I think you can probably make out, we can just show you some of those flowers that have been left by mainly local people who have come to pay their respects to the Duke of Edinburgh. We spoke to one young boy, and interestingly, Sarah was saying that there were a number of young people who had turned up with family to lay flowers at the palace. Well, similar here as well. One boy, when we asked him why he had come to the castle, he said, "I like the Queen," was his response. And his name was Oscar, and he left a very sweet card with the words, "Your Majesty, so sorry about hearing about your amazing husband." Another local woman who we spoke to, who came again to leave flowers, said, "It's really sad. I just wanted him to get to 100 years old." The Duke of Edinburgh, of course, a couple of months off his 100th birthday. But what we're showing you now is just the way down from the castle itself over the past 4 hours or so since the news that the Duke had died. That news rippled through this town. People have been coming over a number of hours, but not in huge numbers. I think people are very well aware, of course, of the COVID restrictions. They've been coming, perhaps spending a bit of time reflecting and leaving flowers here as well. The flowers will no doubt be comfort to the Queen, who over the past year, she and her husband had isolated here at Windsor Castle. They were in a very small bubble with household staff here at the castle. The Duke celebrated his 99th birthday here last year, and they had a very quiet celebration for their 73rd wedding anniversary, spending more time over the past year together as a couple than in previous years. Inside the castle, the Queen, now a widow, life will look very different for her now. And those people who've gathered outside here, Rita, no doubt their thoughts will be with Her Majesty the Queen this evening.
I'm sure that's right. For the time being, thank you very much indeed. That's our correspondent, Helena Wilkinson, there outside Windsor Castle. Well, as we've been hearing, tributes have been paid from around the UK and around the world to Prince Philip, the Queen's husband of 73 years. Richard Galpin reports.
It was shortly before 12:30 this afternoon that the easel with the official announcement that the Duke of Edinburgh had died was carried here to the gates of Buckingham Palace. It said it was with deep sorrow that Her Majesty announced the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Since then, tributes have been pouring in, including from the country's most senior politicians.
It was with great sadness that a short time ago I received word from Buckingham Palace that His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, has passed away at the age of 99. Prince Philip earned the affection of generations here in the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth and around the world.
The UK has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. He dedicated his life to our country, and above all, I think he'll be remembered for his support and devotion to the Queen. And all of our thoughts are with the Queen, the royal family and the British public as they come together to mourn this huge loss.
Here in Holyrood House in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, paid her tribute.
Everybody across Scotland, I know, will want to convey, first and foremost, the condolences that we all feel for the Queen in particular, but for the Duke of Edinburgh's whole family at what is a very, very sad time for them. First and foremost, they are a family, and I think all of our thoughts are with them today.
There were tributes too from the First Ministers of Northern Ireland and Wales.
He had a profound and positive impact on thousands of our young people who found their purpose, passion and place in the world through participation in the Duke of Edinburgh Awards.
On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to Her Majesty the Queen, Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Besides the politicians, other leading figures in the country have expressed their sadness. In a statement, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said he joined with the rest of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth in mourning the loss of the Duke of Edinburgh and gave thanks for his extraordinary life of dedicated service. And here at Aintree Racecourse, flags are at half-mast in tribute to the Duke, who was an honorary member of the Jockey Club. There's also been a 2-minute silence ahead of today's first race in the Grand National Festival. The death of the Duke of Edinburgh has also brought tributes from around the world. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said his thoughts were with the British people and the royal family on the passing away of the Duke of Edinburgh. He had a distinguished career in the military and was at the forefront of many community service initiatives. May his soul rest in peace. And this from the former US President George W. Bush, who said the Duke had devoted himself to worthy causes and to others. He represented the United Kingdom with dignity and brought boundless strength and support to the sovereign. There can be no doubt the Duke leaves a lasting legacy, his unwavering support for the Queen and his patronage of a large number of charities.
And that look back was by our correspondent Richard Galpin. Well, tributes have been pouring in, of course, from across the world to the Duke of Edinburgh. And the First Lady Jill Biden on the passing of Prince Philip. And it reads, on behalf of all the people of the United States, we send our deepest condolences to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the entire royal family and all the people of the United Kingdom on the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Over the course of his 99-year life, he saw our world change dramatically and repeatedly. From his service during World War II to his 73 years alongside the Queen and his entire life in the public eye, Prince Philip gladly dedicated himself to the people of the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and to his family. The impact of his decades of devoted public service is evident in the worthy causes he lifted up as patron, in the environmental efforts he championed, in the members of the armed forces that he supported, in the young people he inspired, and so much more. His legacy will live on not only through his family, but in all the charitable endeavours he shaped. Jill and I are keeping the Queen and Prince Philip's children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren in our hearts during this time. So a very personal and full statement of tribute and remembrance by President Joe Biden and the First Lady Jill Biden. Well, the former Prime Minister Theresa May has also been amongst those speaking in the past few minutes.
Well, I think the whole nation is in mourning at the loss of Prince Philip, and my thoughts and prayers are with Her Majesty the Queen, who has lost the man who was her strength and stay for over 70 years. Prince Philip was a remarkable man, a man of many interests, and he put those interests and his talents to the service, the selfless and committed service of the Queen and the country. I think we have so much to be grateful to him for, probably more than many will ever know. Well, I remember him as somebody who was, of course, that tremendous support for Her Majesty the Queen, but also as a man of many talents. He was an engineer, an inventor, a sportsman. He loved cricket. He had so many different interests. He knew about agriculture. He was incredibly knowledgeable about so many different things. And, of course, a very dry sense of humour. So I will remember him predominantly as somebody who gave that support to Her Majesty, but also had so many interests, among which, of course, was his interest in ensuring that young people were encouraged to aspire, to have their horizons stretched, which, of course, so many millions have seen through the Duke of Edinburgh's awards. I remember one occasion particularly, which actually took place at an event locally where I happened to be sitting next to him a few years ago, and he was talking to me about climate change. And he, of course, is somebody who'd been in many ways ahead of his time in thinking about the issue of climate change and the environment and caring about that. But he was also incredibly knowledgeable. So it was always fascinating to listen to him and to hear him expressing not just views, but his knowledge of these various subjects. I thought he was easy to speak to because he had so many different interests and was so knowledgeable on all of them. But also he did have a very dry sense of humour. You had to understand that he had a dry sense of humour. But he always he wanted to put people at their ease. I think that was important to him. I think he recognised that when the Queen, when they both, or when he visited groups of people, they were obviously perhaps a little bit apprehensive at meeting him or at meeting the Queen, but they wanted to put people at their ease.
The former Prime Minister Theresa May. Well, our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young is at Downing Street for us. And Vicky, MPs will themselves be marking Prince Philip's death in the coming days.
Yeah, that's right. Parliament at the moment is on its Easter recess, so they're not around, but they will be recalled, the House of Commons, on Monday. And at 2:30, tributes to Prince Philip will be led by the Prime Minister. And, of course, all sorts of former Prime Ministers we heard there, but other ministers and MPs who will have come across the Duke over the years, I'm sure will have plenty of tributes and also anecdotes as well. That's certainly what happened when the Commons paid tribute to Prince Philip on his 90th birthday. So that is due to happen on Monday. Now, we know that the Prime Minister, after he heard the news when he was working here this morning, he spoke to Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and they've agreed to suspend campaigning for all those elections going on across the United Kingdom. Now, we don't know how long that suspension will go on for, but really normal politics will be paused. There's, according to the government website, a national mourning of 8 days, and I think during that time we will not be getting the normal government announcements that you might expect from ministers. They will, of course, still be telling the public about anything to do with public health, and particularly, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. So we can expect that to be happening, but not all of the other announcements that you might normally expect to happen. Now, there will be meetings too, sort of operational meetings, really. And what's going on behind the scenes now is there will be discussions being really led by the palace. I'm told that that's what happens here. The government really facilitates the wishes of the palace when it comes to things such as funeral arrangements. We won't know the details of that until the decision has been made and it is announced by Buckingham Palace. So all of that to come, but I think most people assuming that if you look back at previous occasions, the death of the Queen Mother, for example, when she laid in state in Westminster Hall, part of the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster, just across the road, that is very, very unlikely to happen. And already there's been some guidance put out by government sort of urging people really not to gather in large groups because of the COVID pandemic outside royal residences, even though, as we've seen from other correspondents around the country, that many people very much want to do that. The government urging caution because we are still in the middle of that pandemic.
Indeed. Thank you so much. That's Vicky Young there, our Deputy Political Editor in Downing Street for us. Well, reaction from around the world to the Duke's death has continued since the news was announced. And joining me now is Fabian Picardo, who is the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. Hello there to you, Mr. Picardo. Just wanted to know your thoughts and reflections on this sad day.
Well, of course, our thoughts are immediately with Her Majesty the Queen and with other members of the royal family who have lost, not as we have, a member of the hierarchy of our institutions of government, but a loved member of their family. And in Gibraltar, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, was very much loved. He was here often on occasion. He's visited us more than perhaps other members of the royal family have been able to. He brought the Royal Yacht Britannia alongside himself in 1957. He flew in himself, piloting the aircraft that brought him to Gibraltar in 1996. So he has a long track record of knowing Gibraltar and of supporting the people of Gibraltar.
I don't know what your own interactions with the Duke of Edinburgh were like, but give us a sense of the sort of man he was as you found him.
Well, I remember all the times I had the privilege of speaking to him. He was always full of support for the Gibraltarians, full of the recounting of memories of his time in Gibraltar, wishing us well. And it always sticks in my mind that he would always ask me how the convent was. And the convent is the residence of the governor in Gibraltar, where the Duke of Edinburgh would have stayed on each of his occasions in Gibraltar, some of them quite extended. He spent 10 days here at one stage. He opened our Legislative Council back in 1950. So a very strong relationship with Gibraltar that the people of Gibraltar to ensure we remember with fondness.
And you're speaking, of course, as the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, but I wondered about sentiment more wide.
Sadness, yes, not surprise, but I arriving have been carrying flowers, and what they've been doing is walking from the visitor centre here at Sandringham through a wood to the iconic Norwich gates, where they've been laying bouquets of flowers. And I think there's an expectation that many more people will turn up, because in the last hour or so they've been the estate workers here have been laying down a wood chip pathway to the Norwich gates. And I'd say at the Norwich gates right now there's about 3 dozen flowers, bouquets of flowers. Sandringham House, just to give you a sense of the geography, is just beyond that wall over there. Now, importantly, this is not a royal residence. It's not a royal estate. It's a private house owned by the Queen. She inherited it from her father in 1952. And Prince Philip didn't live in the house. He actually spent most of his time at a much more informal cottage called Wood Farm, a couple of miles away in a very quiet, secluded part of the estate, 5-bedroom cottage. And since he retired, that then just gave him the chance to wind down, take breath, and just enjoy his later years. He'd be spent his time painting, shooting, talking to friends, entertaining and reading, and that is what he enjoyed about his latter years here. Sadly, he passed away, as I say, at Windsor Castle. He wasn't able to be here for the last few weeks of his life because he had effectively bubbled with the Queen in Windsor. But certainly this part of the world will miss him very, very much indeed.
Thank you so much. That's Alex Dunlop there at Sandringham for us. Well, Andrew Marr, my colleague, has presented the history of modern Britain, looking at post-war Britain and the Diamond Queen series, as well about the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. And as you can see, he is with me now. Andrew, I don't know if you had time to look at the statement released by President Biden, in which he tried to encapsulate the incredibly long life and the huge history that the Duke of Edinburgh has lived through.
I think this is very much a moment for thinking about perspective in the longer term. Biden's been around for a very long time as well, but when you're looking at the Duke of Edinburgh, you're thinking of somebody who was there to witness the defeat and the surrender of the Japanese imperial forces at the end of the Second World War. You know, I've been reflecting, looking at the pictures. Our royal family, like all royal families around Europe, all the male members at least, have a huge layer of medals on their chests all the time, lots of clanking metalwork on every roll you can think of. This is a man who actually earned his in combat. Two very, very decisive and important battles in the Second World War where he was fighting. He was the youngest, I think, first lieutenant in the Royal Navy at one point. A very, very brave, but also he's just that great scale of history, because we as a country have changed so much, haven't we, from the hierarchical, almost all-white, very imperial connected, rather military, buttoned-up country at the end of the Second World War to the country we are today, a very, very different country, a huge span of history. And the Duke of Edinburgh, like the Queen, has been there with us all the way through, observing. You know, here is somebody who knew all the key leaders of the Soviet Union when it was at the height of its power, who has known every single important 20th century European leader since the war, who has seen it all in front of him. And therefore, you reflect, we are losing, as it were, a living part of our collective history. Whatever you think of monarchy, monarchy goes on and on, generation after generation. A presidential system, you get 4 years, or maybe if you're lucky, 8 years, or whatever it is, and then you've gone. Because of the monarchy, he has been at the epicentre of British power since the 1940s, and that is an extraordinary thing. That is partly why I think a lot of people are reflecting this is a more emotional moment, perhaps, than they were expecting.
So, as you say, the country has changed enormously in these 7 or 8 decades. What about Prince Philip's position, the way in which he's perceived? Because he was a moderniser when he was a young man, wasn't he? But for many younger viewers, he will be seen as somebody old.
A big, hierarchical, traditionalist figure. But no, when he arrived, he was a complete outsider. He wasn't British. He was sort of Danish, Russian, a little bit Greek, a little bit German. I think his, if I can remember it, his original surname was Sonderburg, Glucksburg, Schleswig-Holstein. Then became Battenberg and then Mountbatten and then Windsor. So he was an outsider. He was part of that extraordinary vast web of post-Queen Victoria royals all over the European continent. But his father was in exile, very nearly got himself put up against a wall and shot after an unsuccessful war. He arrives as an exile. His family break into all sorts of different parts. And he comes to fall in love with the Queen, and it was a love match when they were teenagers, as an outsider. He arrives in a very, very authoritarian, prickly, old-fashioned British monarchy. They don't like him much, he doesn't like them much, and he spends a lot of time pressing against the pressures of the royal family, trying to get them to open up more, trying to get some of the more obscure and extreme aspects of hierarchy and court protocol removed. He environmentalises and greens the monarchy very, very early on. But he had to make his own role. There was no set job. When he asked around, he said, so what is the job of the consort? Nobody knew. There had not been a consort since Albert, really. And that was in Victorian times. And he modelled himself on Albert. Another outsider, Albert, was a German, of course, who comes in and tries to modernise Queen Victoria's England, the Victorian monarchy, in a very different age, a very different way. And in a sense, I think the Duke of Edinburgh modelled himself on Albert and had, in many ways, as much success. Though a very, very ambiguous person, a very complicated man, much more sensitive and rather soulful, I think, behind this great prickly defence. Not the difficult, rebarbative man, always dropping clangers, always saying offensive things that some people think about. More interesting than that.
A difficult role for an independent-minded, strong-willed person, because he had to play second fiddle to the Queen all the time.
He was always 2 steps behind, like an Indian bride, as they say. He was always standing behind. He was a very, very impatient, energetic, intellectually curious man, constantly challenging people and things. I think it must be a very, very boring life to be a member of the royal family, frankly. Rita, I think, once you've seen 200 or 300 military parades, you've probably had enough of them. Endless standing around waiting for other people to make speeches, endless observing things. And I think some of his remarks and his comments come from somebody who just got bored a lot of the time and wanted to ask questions, wanted to provoke, wanted to jab people in the chest and get the response. That made him difficult as far as the press was concerned, because they were expecting, as it were, a completely predictable figure who would just say the kind of things you expect a member of the royal family to say, and he was never like that. He was always surprising, as I found out to my cost occasionally.
Tell us more.
No, I've already explained. I was involved in a conversation about Charles Darwin, and I was, like many people when they first meet somebody like the Duke of Edinburgh or indeed the Queen, slightly, perhaps more than slightly nervous and probably babbling on in an inconsequential way. And he wanted to know how important I thought Darwin was in the world of Victorian Britain. And I think Darwin was the single most important Victorian. I think he did more to reshape collective humanity's view of the world than anybody else in his time, and therefore was really more important than any of the prime ministers or generals or anything else. And I sort of explained that in a burbling way, and he paused. It was a pregnant pause, and he stared at me and he said, "I intensely dislike generalisations." And I felt absolutely crushed, because, you know, he would always come back with something sharp and to the point. He was never somebody who enjoyed euphemism or smoothing over language.
We heard exactly the same from Lord Brown, who had dealings with him, that he liked to be absolutely to the point. We should just reflect, before you go, Andrew, on the fact that the Queen, who has had a 73-year marriage to the Duke of Edinburgh, now finds herself a widow.
It must be a very, very difficult day for her, and the next few weeks and months are going to be pretty horrible too. She always relied on him, whether he was at her side physically or whether he was at the other end of a telephone. She always wanted to know what he thought about important matters in terms of things inside the royal family, and there's plenty to discuss there, always. I mean, he was her sounding board. He came forward with his own ideas the whole time. They didn't always agree, I'm sure, but he was always there for her. He was a huge emotional support all the way through, but also an intellectual sounding board, and that has suddenly...